Hello students, in this session we will be discussing on the what are the various elements of the railway track, and also we will be covering the what is a railway gauge and what are all the various requirements of providing a railway gauge, and the classification of the railway gauge will be covered in this session. So first let us look into the permanent way. What is an permanent way and what are the elements of the permanent way? So the picture here will shows you the components, the various components and the elements of the permanent way. So first we'll define what is an permanent way, or you can also call that as an elements of railway track. The track or the permanent way on the rail is nothing but the railroad on which the train will runs, and it is a combination of the rails, so that will be fitted on the sleeper and which rests on the ballast and the subgrade. So the combination of all these things we call it as the permanent way. And the permanent way, how do we construct it? So as I told you, we require the rails which will be fitted on the sleeper, that will rest on the ballast, and finally the ballast will be taken on the subgrade. So now here we will fit the rails into the rails is fitted to the sleeper with the help of the fish plates and the fish bowls, and they are rested on the sleepers with the help of the railway fastening. So we will have the different types of the fastening which is used to connect the rails with the sleepers, and the sleepers will finally rest on the ballast. Okay, and also whenever you construct the permanent way, you should ensure that the different rail sections are properly fitted with the fish plates, and also these sleepers, when you provide these sleepers. Okay, now we'll just look into the picture what are the various components here. So like you can see here, these two are the rail section, nothing but these are all the steel girders on which your trains will run. That is what you can see, the track sections. Okay, so now here the rails, the distance between these two rails need to be maintained, uniform distance need to be maintained. Okay, and the distance between the two subsequent rails, we call it as the gauges. And also the sleepers are nothing but the wooden or the concrete girders on which your rails will be fitted. Okay, and the distance between the sleepers and the railway structure. So first all your train roads will be taken by the rails, and through the rails that will be subsequently transferred to the sleeper section, and then the ballast material will take the load, and finally it will be transferred to the subgrade. Okay, so that's why each and every component in the railway section has to be properly designed so that it will be able to carry the load from the railway track. And also now these whenever the train section will taken on the level section, so the two height of the two different rail sections should be at the equal level. But whereas when it is taken on the curve section, so what we have to do is outer rail is raised slightly with respect to the inner jet. So because we all know there is effect of centrifugal force on the curve, so to counteract the effect of centrifugal force, we need to raise the outer rail with respect to the inner rail, and that will be achieved by using the proper ballast filling. So what we have to do is fill the more ballast on the outer edge compared the lesser ballast cushion and the lower edge. So with the help of the maintaining your subgrade level and the ballast filling, you can achieve the provision of super elevation at the curve. And also the permanent way, it will regarded as a semi elastic material. Okay, so because why we call it as a semi elastic material, so under the application of the wheel load, that will deflect and it will come back to the original position once the load is removed. Okay, and also the track component should be constructed keeping in the view of all the requirements of the various component layer, and which is with the help of it we can achieve higher speed and the better riding quality, and one more thing, with the minimum maintenance. So that is always required for us. So whenever you construct any track, that should have a less maintenance, be properly maintained. As you can see here, this is what the the steel girders, so this we call it as the rails, and the sleepers, the wooden sections, or we call it as the sleepers. The distance between these two sleepers need to be maintained properly, and also the spacing between these two any two sleepers has to be properly filled up with the packing of the ballast. Ballast is nothing but the aggregates filling what we will use. Okay. And also the layer of these ballast will rest on the prepared subgrade that need to be maintained. So now how the load transfer will takes place in case of now we'll to that what are the requirement. As I told you, the permanent has to be constructed keeping in the view of some of the requirement. So now what are all the major basic requirements of a permanent way. So now here there should be a proper, the gauge should be correct and the uniform. What is a gauge? The distance between the two rail section. Okay, so entire track section you should have a correct and the uniform gauge section. The distance need to be maintained properly, and this to be of a proper level. So proper level, when it comes to the proper level, we have two sections. The first section is when it is on a straight track and another is on a curves. Okay, when you take the permanent way on the straight track, the two the level of the two rails has to be same, but on the curve, as I told you earlier, outer edge will be raised with respect to the inner edge. And also what the alignment you construct, that should be correct and they should not have any irregularities. And it should have a proper resistant and elastic property so that the shock it can absorb the track components will have sufficient resistance to absorb the shocks and vibrations of the running tracks, which are at the very high speed carrying a heavy load. And also the alignment, the track should, the drainage properties of the track component should be very good, and which will enhance the safety as well as the durability of the track. And on the curve, the track should be designed and maintained for the proper radii and super elevation, because the safety at which your trains will run on the curves, that will mainly depends upon the how much the radii you have provided and what is the super elevation. Okay, that will decide the what is the speed, also the safety components when the trains travels on the curves. And also all the joints and crossings has to be maintained properly. So we will be discussing what are all these joints and the crossing in the railway section. So anyways, whatever the component we will have in the permanent way, all those things need to be designed and as well as that need to be maintained properly. And we have to provide they should have a adequate provision for the easy renewal and replacement. If any section of your permanent way is damaged, or if it is failed to meet the requirements, it should be possible for us to easy renewal and replacement of such particular component. And also the various components such as the rail fittings, sleepers, ballast formation must satisfy the requirement, or then either it should be, if you feel that at any time the requirement is not satisfying, it should be possible for us to improve or replace the same. So these are already some of the ideal requirements of the permanent way. Your track has to be constructed keeping all these points in the mind. So the next we have the first component of the railway track is the rail gauges. Okay, as you can see here in the picture, these two will gives you the shows the rail section, and the distance between the inner edge of these two rails we call it as the gauge. Okay, so the gauge will be measured as a distance between the inner or running face of the two rail section, or you can also call it as a clear distance between the inner or running face of the two track of the two rail tracks. Okay, so now we'll be discussing here what are all the various types of the railway gauges and what are the requirement and the classification of the rail gauges, and how you can select the various type of the railway gauges we'll be studying further. So now here, depending upon the what is the width you provided, distance between the inner end of the two rail section, in Indian Railways we are having the four different types of the railway gauges. So now the first one what we have call it as the broad gauge, and it is very popularly called as the standard gauge. So, but that the width of the broad gauge is 1.67. So, distance between these two main is 1.676 meter. And the second one is the meter gauge. There is width is the distance between the clear distance is slightly reduced to 1 meter. The second next we have the narrow gauge with the gauge width of 0.762, and the last one is the feeder track or the light gauge with the width 0.610. So combining these together, we call it as the narrow gauge only, with its having a range width of 0.762 to 0.610. The different types of when you have to choose the different various types of the railway gauge. So now we'll look what are the when you have to look into that. The first type of the gauge what we have is the broad gauge. So broad gauge, as I already mentioned you, the broad gauge, the distance between the inner end of the wheel is 1.676 meter. So as you can see, this is the wider gauge among all different category of the gauge, and where it will be suitable, and it will be only suitable when the sufficient funds are available. Okay, so to construct always a wider gauge, we require a lot of funds, and also it will be it will be chosen only in those area where we expect the traffic is more. I mean, to traffic in the terms of both passengers and the goods. So when there is a heavy movements of the passengers as well as the goods, only in those area you can go for the use of the broad gauge. And also when in such area where prospective revenues are bright. Okay, so where there is economical activities are bright in particular area, so in such cases we can use the broad gauges. And also it is that's why keeping in these two mind available fronts and the prospective revenue, so this gauge will be therefore used in the plain areas and also where there are population is densely packed, and also that is the where you are having a maximum traffic and intensity, and the place at which there is a center of industries and the commerce. So maybe the two different places which will connect the major cities or the major industrial areas. So in such cases we can go for the construction of the broad gauges. And in India we also call this as a standard gauge, and which will be adopted in most of the railway track sections. And the other countries which are also using adopted the broad gauges as similar to the India, which includes the Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Argentina, etc. And in India, whatever the total railway track we have, so out of it 50% of the railway track will having a gauge width of the broad gauge, so which is provided with the gauge width of 1.676 meter. The second one is the meter gauge. So now in the meter gauge, the width is 1.00 meter. Okay, it's quietly the narrow one compared to the broad gauge. The width is quietly reduced here. So and the we have the suitability, where it will be suitability. So when the funds of the railway projects are not sufficient or not inadequate, you can go for the construction of the meter gauge, and also in the areas where the prospectures are not very bright. So especially meter gauge will be used in the underdeveloped area. So or when you expect the area to be developed to in such areas, and also interior areas where the traffic is small and the prospective future development is also not very bright. So only in these rows region we can go for the constructions of the meter gauge. And the last one we have the narrow gauge. So in the narrow gauge we have the width restrictions to 0.762 to 0.610 meters. So when you have this particular width will be provided only when there are constructional difficulties. Whenever there is, it is not at all possible for you to either to construct the meter gauge or the broad gauge, only then we will go for the narrow gauge. Such regions include, so we will have the restrictions we will have at the sharp curves, at the gradients, on the bridges, and in the tunnel section. Maybe we may not have a sufficient width or land availability for the construction of the wider gauge. So in such circumstances you can go for the use of the narrow gauges. And also this will be adopted only for those places where the prospective revenues are not bright, and especially it will be constructed in the hilly and very thinly populated areas.